At this point, you may be wondering how I'll try to rectify Adam and Eve, as well as the fall, as non-historical events that still have significance, like I've done with the initial creation story and the Bible's cosmology. And the answer is truly, I won't. Now, don't get me wrong, there will definitely be aspects of what I present here that may not be as widely understood or believed as the traditional view, but it will definitely align more closely to what one may usually expect, as I believe Adam and Eve did exist, and the fall was a historical event. But more on that later. So, with that said, I guess I will start with one of my more unpopular opinions. It'll be good to get it out of the way, and it comes from within the text anyways. So, within Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we actually see two different sets of human beings. In chapter 1, God makes mankind and commands them to subdue the earth and to be fruitful and multiply. This command is not to two people, Adam and Eve, to tend a garden. This is a general call to all of humanity to basically rule over the earth. Genesis 2 goes on to narrate the creation of two separate and distinct humans who weren't among the humans of Genesis chapter 1, as they only come on the scene in chapter 2. But before God creates Adam and Eve, he makes the Garden of Eden, which is a specific area on Earth with a geographical location. So, not only are the humans different, but the entire setting is different, as chapter 1 focuses on the whole world, whereas chapter 2 zeroes in on Eden specifically and what God is doing there. But that's not all. Not only are the humans and setting different, but so is the objective. As I've said before, the humans of chapter 1 are to subdue the earth and multiply and be fruitful, whereas the figures in Eden are to tend the garden. When you start to look at the differences, it becomes somewhat surprising that so many blur the lines between these two distinct events and people, when they're obviously different. Now, if you remember part 1, I argued extensively that a major theme of the opening chapters of Genesis is the connection to the temple and other priestly ideas. Within that, I mentioned that the word translated to work in Genesis 2:15 was the same one used for the priestly duties in the temple. Now, the mere knowledge of that information laid out in part 1 would make the connections to the temple quite apparent, but there is certainly more. You see, the temple was a special place, a place where God himself came down and rested, which is actually pretty similar to his relationship with Eden. It is said that God walked with Adam and Eve. Now, this walk wasn't like our faith walks of prayer or singing songs of worship. No, this was God physically walking with man. But is God's walk amongst man really enough to draw a connection between the temple and Eden? Well, while I do think it is striking, I would say no, not on its own at least. But when we couple this with the information of part 1 and what I am about to present, I think it's a resounding yes. You see, in the ancient Near East, gods were commonly depicted as living in lush gardens on high mountains. This was primarily because of the difficulties of human life and the belief that the gods were above all that. So, with that in mind, Eden is clearly representative of a place that is meant to be the dwelling of God, like the temple would later be, and God brings man into his domain to have a relationship with him. Because of the aforementioned temple connections, the meaning of Genesis 2:15 and Eden being a place that is specifically for God's dwelling, it is reasonable to see Adam as a sort of priest of God. Now, this may seem like a lot of time spent towards what seems to be a pretty generic claim, that Adam functioned as a sort of priest, but by the end of the video, the importance of this position will be quite clear. Now for another controversial argument. Adam wasn't literally made from the dust, and Eve wasn't made from a rib. Let me explain. Now, the idea of Adam not being made of literal dust may not be a surprise if you saw part 1, where I talked about how both other ancient Near Eastern cultures and other texts within the Bible used dust, dirt, clay, and other earthly substances of nature to represent human mortality. But what about Eve? I certainly haven't referenced her creation, and the text seems quite clear that Adam was put into a deep sleep, and God made her from his rib. Well, the deep sleep probably was less like modern anesthesia and more like a visionary experience. God isn't putting Adam under to perform surgical operation, but showing him a vision of his side being taken from him to create Eve. And in case you didn't catch that, I said side, not rib. The Hebrew word for rib is not in Genesis 2. Instead, the Hebrew word Selah is used. Selah is used to refer to the site of the Ark of the Covenant, the site of the hill, and side chambers. See Exodus 25:14, 1 Samuel 16:13, and Ezekiel 41:11 respectively. In fact, the only place in the entire Old Testament where Selah is used as rib is, well, Genesis 2. Because of this, it is more accurate to describe the events of Genesis 2 as Adam, being of dust, which is representative of mortality, being given the opportunity of immortality through the tree of life. In addition to this, Adam is given a vision in which a sight is taken from him, and out of it comes Eve. Because of the ambiguity in the passage, Eve's true origins are left primarily to speculation. Now, to wrap things up, I want to talk about the fall. Although my position of what the fall is differs from the popular level to some degree, that doesn't mean I don't believe it happened, or that it isn't similar to the popular view. Now, the popular understanding is that originally everything was perfect and free of death, but because of man's sin, death was brought into the world and severed our relationship with God. But then Christ came to reconcile us and will one day return the cosmos to its original perfect state. Now, obviously I disagree with parts of this because I believe there was physical death prior to the fall. So, how would I go about describing the fall? Now, what happened was that man lived in a world littered with death, pain, and suffering. But God, out of his gracefulness, brought Adam and Eve into his domain, a place where they could function as priests for him and live forever with God in paradise due to the tree of life. Now, as a side tangent, defining sin can be a tad tricky, but a good working definition is really anything that violates God's laws or commands. At this time, God only gave one command, not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But, because they ignored this command, they brought sin into the world. Because of their sin, God cast them out of the garden, and as such, man's relationship with God was severed. But after this, Christ came to reconcile us, and one day we will have that same sort of relationship with God that Adam and Eve did. Where the first priest Adam failed, the great priest Christ succeeded. And in between the fall and the incarnation, we see the story of man trying to get to God time and time again to regain that status man had in Eden. Whether it be the Tower of Babel, which was condemned, or the construction of the temple, which was good. Man is constantly trying to reconcile themselves with God, but we can't do it on our own. We can only do it through Christ, God in the flesh, who is the perfect sacrifice that paid for our sins. And because of Christ, we can have hope in restoring that original relationship with God that man had all the way back in Eden.